the light need to come out from the other side. It doesn't come out, it's unscientific. But in the case of the commission, I can say it is the case of a reverse prism, where everybody comes from a different color, but what comes out is a universal international law, an international law which is an outcome of consensus, an outcome of agreement. It may be a compromise, but it's a healthy compromise. It's an intellectual compromise. It is a different compromise from a compromise which takes place in the Sixth Committee. The compromise that takes place in the Sixth Committee is a political compromise, although on the legal document. But here, it's purely based on legal reasoning, there may be policy reasons, and on the basis of all these experiences and backgrounds, what comes out is a consensus document. Then this document is finally, the provisions which have been adopted are taken to the plenary. When they are taken to the plenary, what happens is that the chairperson of the drafting committee gives his statement to the plenary and informs what happened in the drafting committee. Now this statement of the chairperson of the drafting committee is a very important document. I don't say that because I was chairing the drafting committee last year. I say that because that is the only available record of what happened in the drafting committee. Therefore, it is in other words, the travaux préparatoire, the preparatory work of that provision. If you want to know why this provision was drafted in a certain manner, you need to look at the chairman of the drafting committee, statement of the chairman of the drafting committee to understand as to how the provision has transformed. Because provisions undergo a great deal of transformation. Plenary gives a great amount of discretion to the drafting committee. The plenary says, drafting committee may do whatever it feels like, of course within a specific purview, because it is going to report back. So at times it happens that we go into the drafting committee with one draft article and we come out with 3 draft articles. Or we go with 5 draft articles or come up with 1 or 2 draft articles. So it's possible that it might undergo massive transformation in the drafting committee. So drafting committee, I like to call it as the intellectual den. It's an intellectual cave. And it's very intense, its members are impromptu, there's no written statement. You can often see members hooked on to their computers, not like reading news, as some of you might be right now, but I hope not. And constantly trying to look up the text, trying to look up what draft proposal should I suggest, what suggestion should I make. And while drafting, you have to follow all the drafting principles, and one of the drafting principles is consistency. If the commission has used a certain language in certain context, then the commission should be consistent, because if the commission changes that trend, then there would be questions. An interpreter would say, why has the commission used a different language in this provision as compared to its earlier work in this provision, which means the commission intended to have something else in this new provision. So the commission has to be very careful about what it drafted in the past, has to go back and try to constantly look and find a balance and then come out accordingly. Then we go back to the plenary, give it to and then the plenary adopts it, and there are provisions adopted by the end of the year, the report is adopted, the report is sent to the General Assembly, states comment on it, then it comes back, it takes several years, then we finish the first reading, send it to the states, get the comments of the states, do the second reading, and then we send it off to the General Assembly again. After we have sent the product to the General Assembly, there are a few outcomes. The first outcome is, let me start with the worst outcome. States say, good job, thank you very much, we don't need it. It happened once. It happened with the ones that I remember is with the draft articles on most favored nation treatment. The commission worked on it, sent it off, states said, good job, thank you very much, we don't need it. Which is the worst case scenario, because you've worked so hard on something and the states didn't like what you prepared. Which of course is never a waste, because you have several academics writing it, it often gets circulated in courts and tribunals. The MFN draft articles have been used by some investment arbitration tribunals here and there. So it does have a value because it's a very solid work which takes into account state practice, academic literature, and procedure. Then what happens is, the second consequence is somewhere in between. That is, the Sixth Committee, that is the member states say, good job, we take note of it. That's it. So it's much better than the first scenario where they don't care. In the second scenario, we take note of it, which means we are still thinking. This taking note of is an outcome of the requirement of consensus in the sixth committee. The sixth committee works with consensus. There's no vote. So unless everybody agrees, a resolution cannot be passed. And it's very difficult to get everybody to agree. Therefore, often what happens is they simply say, we note it and then put it aside. The ILC draft articles on state responsibility, which you all have been used, must have used frequently, has been noted by the General Assembly. But if you look at courts and tribunals, virtually everybody is using it in one way or the other. Which also means that even if the work of the Commission is put on hold, or in a sense not on hold, but simply acknowledged and not fully adopted, yet that work seeps into international adjudication and does carry a lot of weight. The third scenario is a win-win scenario, where the sixth committee says, excellent, we adopt it, and we convene a diplomatic conference, we have a convention, and the work of the Commission gets a formal form. That happened in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, 1958 Geneva Conventions, several conventions in relation to diplomatic relations, consular relations, and the rest. So these are the different consequences which might arise from a codificatory and progressive development process. Now, where does India stand in all this? I'm not sure if I'm the right person to speak about it, because I'm myself involved, or maybe when I finish my term on the Commission, maybe then I can talk about how horrible I was on the International Commission. But India has been one of the members, or one of the states who have been always on the international order, except for a very brief period in between. So we started, when the Commission was created, in the first round, Indian member was elected. It was Indian Ambassador Rao, who was the first member of the International Law Commission. Then Rana Vinod Pal was a member. Then Narendra Singh was a member after that. Then S.P. Jagota was a member. Dr. P.S. Rao was a member. Then Narendra Singh was a member. And then I am a member now. So India has always been present on the International Law Commission, especially when the whole third world international law, not the scholarship sense, but as the Global South movement was very strong, which was in the 60s and 70s. That's the time when Indian members were very vocal and very active as well. It was especially in relation to state responsibility. State responsibility is a well-known issue because it took almost 40 years for the Commission to complete it. It took 40 years because the project underwent a lot of changes. When the project began, it began as state responsibility of state, a responsibility of states for treatment of aliens, which is basically what is now a part of foreign investment law and all that. This was a highly divisive topic. Members were divided, states were divided, and therefore there was a resistance of obviously members who came from the Global South, and of course Indian member was one of them, who opposed state responsibility on codification of state responsibility on treatment to aliens. And then eventually the state responsibility articles were narrowed down, and now they are in the form of secondary norms, and then much later they got adopted. So that's where we did have of course we have always had a prominent role, but that's where it comes out, or it is shown prominently. Dr. P.S. Rao was the first and only special rapporteur that India has had on the International Law Commission. He was working on transboundary harm from hazard space, and he completed a very difficult topic which was facing a lot of trouble, had to be split into two topics, and then he could manage to finish that topic. And now I'm there. I don't think it would be fair for me to assess my performance. It's for the jury's out. But that's where we all stand. But I'm normally one of those members who speak on every topic. I'm one of those members who are present in every drafting committee. I'm one of those members who are present in every committee, and probably in every lunch, dinner, or session. I can tell you I'm quite active there. So good, that's what is an insight on international law. I hope I should stop my monologue here and open myself for questions.
Yes.
Is that a good time
Yes,
to stop
absolutely.
and
Yes,
receive some questions?
Yes.
Good. Questions, comments, criticisms? Yes.
So you mentioned how you're in India on the committee, but you're not necessarily representing India. But let's say you're in the middle of a debate, or you're arguing something in the drafting committee. Like somewhere in your head, does the foreign policy of the country that you represent play a role in your opinion, or what you're discussing right now?
Yes. A journalist answer is no. Well, I have to be very honest in a sense. It's not really a foreign policy is driven by political considerations. And what we are dealing with are very fundamentally legal issues. So I would say that whether it functions subconsciously at the second or the third level of my consciousness, that is probably for a psychologist to analyze and tell me. But I don't think it functions on anybody's mind really in the commission. And you can see that because we often take positions which are absolutely against what our states think. Or even if our positions match with what our states think are because of not national alignment, but because of the way we think. Let me give you an example. There was a great division on draft Article 7 of immunity of state from foreign criminal jurisdiction on which there was voting. For an outsider, I took a position which would have been a classical Indian position. But the reason I took that position, because that was my conviction was. And the reason for my conviction was, I consider myself to be a positivist international lawyer. A positivist international lawyer is going to ask you, all right, if you want me to conclude something, show me state practice. If there is none, then sorry, I can't agree with you. But for a natural law lawyer, he'd say, well, this is good for the world. State practice can follow or may not follow. So if we look at the commission, and if we look at the divisions, I think it will be very unfair for anybody to simply say that we took positions which suit our home countries. But I have always looked at it, and I have always tried to, and I think objectively stated, and that's what my feeling always was in the commission, that the positions that we took were an outcome of our view of international law. So the positivist international lawyers were visibly seen in one camp, and the other international lawyers who were, some of them were critical, some of them were natural lawyers, or some of them were of course positivists but wanted to be natural lawyer in that context. So it is that ethos. And therefore if you look at the statute of the ILC, it says people or the members, or the membership rather, when I say people I mean the members, the membership has to come from different backgrounds. The background has to be from different cultures and from different legal backgrounds, although the word uses legal background, which is common law, civil law, or some other training. But there is also a cultural component. Of course, I come from the global south, so the way in which I look at the relationship between a developed country and a developing country is going to be different. I come from a country which is a rising jurisdiction, which is not a poor, impoverished, third world corner on the periphery screaming country anymore, which is a country right in the center, has a prominent role. So it is obvious that, that the positions I take are of a nature of my culture, an outcome of my culture, because I am an outcome of my culture. So I would probably not be as harsh as people are in certain cultures, although many people would disagree that I'm not harsh. But what I mean is I may be harsh on the content of my work, but in terms of personal relations, I'm not harsh because I am an outcome. Indians are easygoing, nice people, I suppose. May not be to each other, but to outsiders, you know? Yes, sir.
So, how influential is trade in the ILC? Any third-world approach, is it received well? Are arguments based on whale made in the ILC? Is legal reason the government approach?
Very, very good point. I may be from the third world, but I don't like the third world. I like you must read this very interesting, it's not a personal account, but it's not an autobiography as such, but it is in a sense an autobiography plus a national account of his country by Lee Kuan Yew, called From Third World to First World. So he doesn't want to be saying, oh, I don't want to be called third world anymore, I'm first world, why should I be called second and third? Right? Third world was basically not a badge of honor. So why should I get myself called third world? I don't think I fall into that third world aura as such, or the category as such. But if you look at the contents of the Wales scholarship, there is, with due respect, there is very little defined on positive international law because it is not a positive law methodology. So you can't find positive law outcomes in third world. But let me highlight, give one example, and then I will leave it to you to assess as to where I fall. Because often these assessments are done by others. We were having a discussion on the role of the General Assembly resolutions in identification of customary international law. I was never a part of the commission when that provision was adopted and when the commentaries were adopted. I became a member and I could only comment on the second reading, which means I had a very limited role on the second reading. In my view, there has to be a greater role for the General Assembly resolution because it is truly representative rather than the Security Council, or if, of course, Security Council actions are binding under the Charter. General Assembly can simply, it does not have that not normative, but a practical force, more policy, right? So I'm quite a supporter of what the General Assembly does. My reading of the commentary was, I don't precisely remember the wording, but I was saying that you have pushed it 2 degrees down. I want it to be 2 degrees up. On which the special rapporteur was unwilling. There was a bit of an exchange. Finally, he agreed for a compromise, saying, all right, I will elevate it one step up, which means you get 1 step less, and I get to give you 1 step up. The wording was such, which in my view, it downgraded it to 2 levels. I wanted it 2 ways up. I could 2 steps up. I couldn't get it 2 steps up, but I got it 1 step up. Which, for somebody might be a pretty much dual representation. But I'm not sure if I can fall in that. It also depends on where the Quail stands. I think today Quail has become too much of critical scholarship than positive scholarship. But this debate is in public domain, so maybe if you go on the audio recordings and watch the days, it will probably look good. Yes.
So with regards to, you said that there are different types of scholars, like positives, international lawyers, and international lawyers, and critical, those who are the critical. So when there's a mix of all of these people in the drafting committee, how does it work? Because I don't think all of these would be, even if they might come to the same outcome, somehow they might not be amenable to reaching the same conclusions with regards to the philosophy behind the law, which should be the first step.
Yeah. Raised a good point. When I said people broadly belong to this philosophy, doesn't mean that they would agree they belong to that philosophy. So if you hear them and go and ask them, oh, you're a naturalist, so what do you mean? I'm a positivist. It's possible. So, these ideological distinctions are not so rigid as such. Or even if you can feel that somebody comes from that background, but his positions on certain issues are very different. Like I remember a member whom I would always treat as a natural lawyer in his academic writings, but in the commission on several issues, he is a harsh positivist lawyer, more positivist than I am. Or on some occasions, people might say, oh no, you're being naturalist on this. So it's not really as straitjacket as we can only make that assessment after we have heard the debate. That yeah, on this point he was being naturalist, on this point he was being positivist. But as I said, when it all goes in the crucible, there's an exchange, there's a cooking. What comes out is a product. Of course, as I said, it's not easy. There are some very difficult conversations, some very uncomfortable conversations. But since everybody is driven by the same goal of progressive development and codification and its contribution to international peace and security, we all end up converging, giving up our positions and coming to a position that is agreeable to everyone.
So can you talk a little about your book, because
My book?
yes, the new one which you said that you would like to tell us about. If you could just give a little synopsis of what is it?
Yes. It's a project where the title of the project is Regulatory Freedom and Indirect Expropriation in Investment Arbitration. Now, one of the major areas, you all are aware of investment treaty arbitration, right? Where there is an investor from one state invests into another state and is given a protection under the bilateral investment treaty between the state to which the investor belongs and the state in which the investment is made. Now, what are the rights and obligations are normally specified in that bilateral investment treaty? A question often arises that if a state changes its regulatory framework, then is a state in breach of the bilateral investment treaty. Often people say that it falls in the category of indirect expropriation. Expropriation is where a state takes somebody's property, and indirect expropriation is where the state doesn't take the property but has the consequence of destroying the property. And I argue is that the right to regulate is a customary international law right. I find state practice, opinio juris, to conclude that there is enough practice to suggest that there is regulatory freedom of states. And by using the analogy of Nicaragua, Article 15 and customary international law, self-defense, where the court said despite its codification in Article 51, you still have customary international law. And then I looked at several decisions of the ICJ, PCIJ, the navigation rights case, or other cases, and fisheries case, where despite the presence of a treaty, the court looked at customary international law to find whether the state met certain rights, and then found out that as long as there are aspects of regulatory freedom in customary international law that is not covered by the provisions of the bilateral investment treaty, a state can perfectly regulate. And that regulation would have to be bona fide, non-discriminatory, and in public interest. If a regulation satisfies these tests, I've elaborated on those tests, then that measure would be a regulatory measure, and the state would not be responsible for the consequences of the measure. And in the process, what I do is I try to challenge the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is the sole effects doctrine. According to this doctrine, what a lot of commentators and virtually a large majority of investment tribunals say is don't look at the nature of the measure, look at the consequences of the measure. Once there is a loss, you have to pay compensation. It doesn't matter by the loss of. I'm saying how can that be? Because the idea is not taking, it's an indirect consequence. And then I traced the background of the sole effects doctrine, which took me back to the Iran West Claims Tribunal, which took me back to PCIJ. And then I realized that's not what the cases were saying. And it's all based on misinterpretation of some PCIJ decisions. So sole effects doctrine is an improper doctrine, and we need to look at the nature of the measure. So that's what I did in my book. Yes?
So how was the life different, how has the life changed from even traditional being a start with the practicing?
Yes, the first way in which my life has changed is I have started forgetting my jacket, which I never forgot in the past. So I have started forgetting meetings, I've become more academic. So yes, it has partially made me more academic, but what I like the most about the commission, it's more of a personal experience, and I don't think I should shy away from sharing it. I often feel that it's intellectually it is the best thing that has happened to me. Because let's be honest, international lawyers are slightly arrogant people. Lawyers are arrogant, and international lawyers are more arrogant because they're international lawyers, right? So if you are in company of international lawyers, it's a bit difficult to have conversations with them because everybody thinks, it's God's gift to humanity. But in the commission, it just doesn't matter who you are. What matters is what you talk about. So even the grandest professor in a big university in Germany who has several people working for him, who's like an emperor, is a normal person like you, and exchanging and disagreeing and fighting and getting uncomfortable.